So 10 mistakes to avoid if you're preparing answers to behavioral questions. The first one, and probably the most obvious of all, is that you should actually use the star format for these answers. And if you're only getting started with these things and you are bombarded with information saying don't use star, use par, or use whatever other iteration of this method, please don't take those seriously, because star works just fine for whatever the role you're applying for, at least in the beginning. The second mistake that many people do while preparing behavioral answers to questions is that their answers are too long. And this is actually a more serious problem than it seems at first, because especially if you prepare them in writing, if you spend double the time that you would normally do to answer a question because you want to make it too long, it will actually double the overall time you spend preparing answers to these questions. What's the problem with this? You will have half of the time to actually practice answers to these questions, which is essential, which is very important. So you don't want to do this. So make sure your answers aren't too long, right? The third mistake that people often make while preparing these types of answers to behavioral questions is that they are not quantifiable. Like if you failed at some point, try to quantify the impact it had. If you delivered something successful, how successful it was, quantify things. If you talk about the situation where you're leading a project, how big was your team? If you're talking about a time when you delivered on a tight deadline, what was the deadline? If you talk about a significant project, how would you quantify the significance of that project? How would you talk about the scale, and so on and so forth? The fourth problem that many people do not actually realize from the first shot that they have is that they are they are much less positive than they should with their answers. So this might not seem obvious on paper, but as soon as you try to speak an answer, you would realize that you would introduce some follow-up sentences, some extra sentences that are not needed for this, or the overall energy in that answer is quite negative, to be honest, quite boring. So if they do sound like this, there's definitely a point that you must reconsider the way you formulate your answer to make it more engaging, more positive. The fifth problem I want to talk about here is don't use examples of projects that happened more than 7 years ago or more than 5 years ago in most cases, depending on your experience. If your experience spans over the past 20 years, I would say don't go beyond 7 years. If your experience is only 8 years, I would say don't go over 5 years. So the more recent the examples, the much better it is. Of course, keeping in mind the main thing is to have a strong example in the first place. So if your strongest example is 5 years back and your least strongest is 1 month ago, go with the 5-year one. That's the most relevant that you should talk about. But recent ones is the generally accepted rule that are the best perceived by interviewers. Number 6 here, talking about mistakes, is the dilemma of whether you should use we or I did this for something. What happens here, to clarify something, so the reason why many HR people recommend to say I did this, not we did this, is because junior roles only, tend to take credit for some achievements that they might not have been necessarily theirs. This is the only reason why they say use I did, not we did. For more senior, mid to senior roles, you could actually say we did this. So it's actually very much encouraged because you show up as a team player. You don't show as maybe not owning, maybe you not being the main stakeholder of this project, because they could simply ask you follow-up questions for this. So I just wanted to clarify that we did versus I did. We did makes perfect sense for mid to senior roles. For junior roles, always I did. I did this, I did that. Number 7, make sure, and this is especially for on-site interviews, make sure you have a sufficient number of stories, of different stories that you may use to answer questions. In the case of an Amazon interview, that's usually 5 hours. that you should prepare between 15 and 20 different types of stories. The general rule is that you should prepare 2 stories for each of the 14 leadership principles, and because there's some inevitable overlap, you'll end up with around 20 stories or so. But the idea is to have diversity, because if you don't have diversity, you will be talking about the same answer over and over again, which is a disqualifier in many cases. So you should have a diverse experience, and you should be able to showcase that with your answers. Number 8 mistake that people do while preparing answers to behavioral questions, that they do not prepare answers to failure stories. So you should have, I usually recommend people around 3 failure stories to be sure you have them. And what's a good failure story? A quantifiable one. So if it's not quantifiable, more likely it's a so-so story. So there's that. Prepare at least 3 failure stories, because this is a very important topic in job interviews, not only at Amazon, but throughout high-performing companies these days. Twitter actually has a very thorough interviewing process when it comes to the behavioral part. So definitely keep in mind the failure stories. Number 9 that mistake people do while preparing answers to behavioral questions is that you should also prepare answers to tell me about yourself and why do you want to work for this company. And yes, these are not necessarily behavioral questions, although you could say they are. But still, if you don't prepare answers for these, you risk having an entry question for which you haven't prepared for. And it's a pity if you wouldn't have answers for these questions prepared in advance, because they are the starting point of a conversation. So basically, you want the conversation to flow your way, right? And number 10 mistake, not necessarily mistake, but number 10 piece of advice that I would want to give here is somewhat related with the second piece of advice. I said your answers tend to be too long, but as soon as you find that you have the right type of example to showcase, to talk about, try to keep it in 1.5 minutes. Don't go beyond 1.5 minutes for a spoken answer. So just test yourself how fast can you speak, and try to keep this 1.5 minutes rule in mind, because more often than not, if you go beyond 2 or 3 minutes, your answer is very likely to sound boring. And again, I'm talking about the behavioral questions here, not about the technical ones. In technical ones, it's a different story. There you can take your time, you can do whatever it takes to answer the question as detailed as possible, as good as possible, you see fit. But in behavioral questions, 1.5 minutes is where you want to be, keeping in mind that the most important thing is to have a strong example in the first place, right? So this would be my 10 pieces of advice when it comes to preparing answers to behavioral questions. Hopefully at least some of these points help you to better accelerate and better prepare these types of questions. And if you want to support this channel, please share your interview outcomes in the comment sections of the videos. And as always, thank you very much for watching.